Well, here's some specific advice for you if you're working in internal comms and you're wondering about making your podcast private. And this is something I get asked a lot. People will come on the course and they're coming from this internal comms job role and they say, how can we lock it down? How can we get our podcast behind the intranet or locked down and just going through our employee engagement app? And I absolutely understand that if you work in internal comms, your instincts, maybe even your manager, are going to be telling you to lock down this podcast. We love the idea of podcasting, but how do we make it private? If that's what you want to do, I'm going to show you how to do it in just a second. But before that, I'd like to challenge your thinking. Do you really need to make your podcast private? Does it contain elements within it that are absolutely mission critical and so sensitive that you cannot risk them going public at all? And if that's the case, then you shouldn't even be doing it on a private podcast. If it's so sensitive, and if it getting out would be so damaging, then why are you even telling people at all? So I'd like to challenge that thinking straight off the bat. The second thing I'd like to say is there are lots of organizations I've worked with and lots of people from internal communications who have started off thinking we need to make this private. And when I've challenged that thinking, they end up saying, you know what, actually, we could take the internal and we could make it external. And you might need to make some changes and you might need to be careful. But could we make the internal external? And there are some organizations who have won tremendous benefits, lots of goodwill, and got some really good results by doing exactly that. And if you think about the work that we do in external comms, trying to convince the public or people that we want to recruit or other stakeholders, trying to convince them that we're a diverse organisation, we care about our staff, we innovate, we're sustainable. Here's all this good stuff we're doing for the charitable organisations in our community. Our external comms colleagues jump through hoops to try and make that happen. You're already telling that story in internal comms. So this internal podcast, if we do make it public, and yes, there might be some bits in it that are of not particular interest to the general public, the external audience, but is telling that story going to do us serious harm? And if it's not, then I think you should think really carefully. Yes, this podcast is intended for an internal audience and will mainly be an internal audience, but maybe there's some additional benefits if we just make it external. And one of the big benefits is by making it external, it's so easy for people to listen. So your own staff, they'll find it much easier to listen to your podcast if it's on Apple and it's on Google and on Spotify and all the other apps. Why? Because that's where they're already listening to the podcasts that they like. Don't make them jump through hoops and log on to the intranet or go through the app, playing your playing field. If they already like listening to podcasts, make it really easy. Remove as many barriers as you can. And if they hear something in your podcast that they think, oh, my friend might be interested in that role. My local politician should know about this campaign that this company that I work for are doing. I'll share it with them. You don't want it all to break down because they can't get access to your app or your intranet. So please think carefully. Challenge it. Could you make the internal external? Does your company podcast really need to be locked down and 100% private? And if it does, I'll show you how to do that in a moment. Now, there is an advantage with having a podcast that is locked down and restricted to your intranet and your app, and that is around the analytics. If somebody has to log in and register, if you've had to whitelist their email address before they can hear your podcast, if they subsequently do log on and listen, then you can gather a lot of data about them. You know their name, you know when they listened, you know what device they used, you know how far they went, what other stories that they went and accessed. So analytics is a big one. You know the person's name and you know everything that they did, everything that they clicked while they were on there. Now the disadvantage is that I think your own staff often can be harder to please than the general public and the customers. They might already be a bit cynical and feel a bit distant with your organisation. Why would they want to? They work for you all the day anyway. why would they want to go and listen to your podcast? Surely if they're going to listen to a podcast, it's to escape the workplace. That's one way of looking at it. And of course, you'll have some staff that are hyper engaged and want to listen because they want to move on and they want to be seen to be engaging with you. But you'll have others that couldn't care less. So I think the internal staff podcast has to work harder to cut through and to get noticed and to serve a purpose. If you are locking it down for your internal audience, the accessibility is more important. So you have to, I think, create transcripts. You can't be leaving out a section of your own staff. It's bad enough if you do it with part of the public, but you really can't do it with your own staff. And so how you do it? Well, you could simply embed an MP3 audio file on your intranet. You could password protect it within a blog post or news article. So do you want a specific section on your website, your intranet, for podcasts? Or are you just going to publish news articles and blog posts as you currently do and put the podcast within them? And that's probably the easiest way of doing it. Now, if you want a proper private podcast, you might be using already a hosting provider who can allow that for you. There's some third-party tools we're going to look at as well. And if you are engineering this yourself, if you're talking to colleagues in IT, or if you don't work in a large organization, but you just want, for whatever reason, a private podcast, what you need to do is set up a private RSS feed and then give people access to that. So people that you choose get access to a private RSS feed. The private RSS feed won't work on Google or Apple or Spotify or TuneIn. It's not going to go to any of these places. You can control who gets access to your private RSS feed. That's really what you're setting up here. So a few tools that are doing it now. Storyboard Podcasts emerged quite quickly as one of the best. This is what they specialize in for companies, teams and organizations that want podcasting locked down to their internal audience. The beauty of it is they can still listen on their own device. So as long as they put the Storyboard app on their own smartphone or tablet, you can choose to give them access to your podcasts. And instead of listening to their favorite podcast app, they listen to the Storyboard app, but it gives them access to your podcast. You get some great analytics. You can also give, you can set people up with different access levels. So some people can listen to all your podcasts and some can only listen to podcasts about particular topics and particular themes. So Storyboard Podcasts is well worth a look at trystoryboard.com. You'll also find that some of the hosting providers offer it as an additional extra. So Podbean has an enterprise private podcast solution. And you can go and find out a little bit more about that. Another one that's worth considering is Patreon. Now Patreon's intended for, small freelancers, hobbyists, semi-professional podcasters who didn't have another method of monetizing their program. It's now grown, and you can give people, the kind of obvious example would be the podcaster that's ticking along and doing quite well with their podcast. Maybe isn't big enough to insert advertising revenue in it, but wants to create a membership tier, wants to give people the opportunity to subscribe to their podcast and offer them maybe bonus content, additional episodes, maybe advertising free or sponsorship free episodes. And so Patreon's a method of doing that as well. It's really locked in to monetizing it as well. So the idea is that people are paying Patreon. They're paying you, but Patreon's taking a commission. They're paying via Patreon and getting access to your content. If it's your own staff rather than the general public, then you might be better with using trystoryboard.com. So in summary, locking down a podcast for an audience that you select is fairly straightforward to do. The problem with it is that you are in the process making it a wee bit more difficult for people to listen because they have to listen on your intranet, on your app, or on a specific third-party tool rather than the podcasting app that they're already enjoying. The big advantage for you is much closer, deeper analytics. But please do think carefully about the potential benefits of making the internal external. And remember one thing we haven't mentioned yet, you can have as many podcasts as you want. You're not restricted to simply one. So you could have one podcast intended for the general public and another one intended for your own staff, but both of them fully public.